And those people who were baptized began to tell. The apostles continued to tell. And dozens of people were being told the gospel, were submitting to the gospel, were obeying the gospel, to the point that the Bible records that there were daily additions. Acts 2:47, the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. It's recorded throughout that book. For an example, in Acts 16:5, the churches began to be edified, and there were daily conversions. Now stop for just a second, and let me ask you a question. I'll ask it, then we'll come back to it a little bit later. How often is the water of the baptistry stirred in our buildings? When can you remember it being stirred daily? Just note that and hold it. Hold that thought, and we'll come back to it. As the gospel was spread, as it was continued to be preached, and there were daily additions, as you might well understand, that got the attention of folks in town, so to speak. And those officials, those public officials, that were the leaders, and remember you had the religious leaders and the political leaders were basically all together, working together, were the same people in many cases. But they felt threatened. At that time, you see, that nation or that group of people were living in a militarily occupied land. It was populated by Jews, but it was controlled by the military of the Romans. And so you had the Romans concerned. These people are, there's talk about a new king, Jesus. A talk about a new king. We got to put a stop to this. And then the local people, they didn't want any problem with Rome. They didn't want any problem with Caesar. And besides, they had the people following them. And now all of a sudden they're hearing about this Jesus as being the king of the Jews. Well, there was a lot of opposition. It escalated rapidly, and then there became a lot of persecution. And when you're under fire, your true colors start coming out. And they were arrested. They were told, you are going to stop what you're doing. We don't want to hear any more about it. Stop it right now. And when they were told that, the response by Peter and others was, as illustrated in Acts 5:29, we've got to obey God rather than man. And you judge whether or not we're going to listen to you or listen to God. Remember, it was God who gave them the charge. And they knew that. And they had a conviction that ran so deep that nothing was going to deter them. The threat of persecution, it didn't stop them. And when you read the 4th and 5th chapters of the book of Acts, you just have to be not only impressed, I think even amazed at how unflappable they were. And they were told time and time again, stop this, stop this. And in the 5th chapter, toward the end of the 5th chapter of the book of Acts, they had Peter and John there in prison again. And they are determined to find a reason to kill them. And that's when someone with a level head stood up and said, if you kill them, you're asking for more trouble. If this is nothing it'll go away. Just let them alone. And if it's of God, there's nothing you can do to stop it. And the authorities listened. Are you listening? So they turned them loose? Not yet. They tied them. They tied them down. And they beat them. Then they turned them loose with one final charge. Don't be doing this anymore. So they walk out with their backs bloody, bruised, hurting. And the biblical record says, as they walked out, they thanked God that they were worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. Now remember what they've just been told. Stop this. And the final statement in the 5th chapter of the book of Acts is, and they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ every day in the temple, that's publicly, and from house to house, wherever the people lived. So the persecution didn't slow them up. But the persecution didn't slow down either. And it escalated to a point that a lot of them had to leave their houses. They had to leave their homes. I can imagine some of them maybe saying, this is where I grew up. This is home. But because of the persecution level, they had to leave. Now I want you to read something with me. Open your Bibles to the book of Acts, to the 8th chapter. Acts chapter 8. And I think I noticed that a lot of the Pew Bibles are New King James Version. And I'm going to read from the King James Version. You won't have any trouble following it in the New King James, or in what other translation you may have with you. But I want you to read something with me. What we're going to do now, I'm going to tell you ahead because I don't want you to get lost in this. We're going to read Acts 8, verse 1, and then verse 4. So follow as I read now. And Saul was, by the way, that is the man that became Paul, the apostle. And Saul was consenting unto his death. That's the death of Stephen. That's told about in the previous chapter. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Therefore, they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Now I'm going to reread this, and this time I'm going to leave out 3 words. Read verse 1 again. We'll just start with the second sentence. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. Then you read verse 4, therefore they that were scattered abroad. What did I leave out? Except the apostles. So what do you conclude? Well, the message is that these Christians had to leave home. They were scattered abroad because of the persecution. It's just such an outbreak of persecution. They got to leave for their safety's sake. But who stayed in Jerusalem? The apostles. And they continued to preach and teach. But what about those that left? Verse 4, those that were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. It will not surprise you in the context of that when I tell you or remind you of this, that about, this is just roughly speaking, but about 30 years later, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the church in Colossae, and he said the gospel has been preached to every creature under heaven. It's been preached to every creature under heaven. 30 years. Wait a minute. How'd they do that? They didn't have the internet. They didn't have planes.